The difference between the Secretary of Defense and a president's national security advisor is the difference between Rasputin and the Pope. One is a clearly defined role with legally recognized privileges and responsibilities, and the other can lead the seance, reconnecting you with your dead betta fish while also advising on issues of international importance, and none of us would be any wiser. Hey friends, it's Maggie from Non-State Actress, and today we're looking at the difference between the structure around the Secretary of Defense job and the President's National Security Advisor. The Pope versus Rasputin comparison might seem a little intense, but it's honestly a really good one, and not just because it lets me sing that song in my head. So here's a list of things that are similar about the role of the Pope and the job of the Secretary of Defense. 1. There is a job, and it is required by the relevant guiding documents. In the case of the Secretary of Defense, we have Section 10, Title 113 of the U.S. Legal Code, which is like all of the laws, basically. And that section says, direct quote, "There is a Secretary of Defense who is the head of the Department of Defense appointed from civilian life by the President by and with the advice and consent of the Senate." Somewhat similarly, the Catholic Church's canon law codes does basically the same thing for the Pope. Next, both run really large institutions filled with customs and bureaucracy. So to cite the U.S. Code again, the Secretary is the principal assistant to the President in all matters relating to the Department of Defense, subject to the direction of the President, and to this title and Section 2 of the National Security Act of 1947, which is honestly like my favorite document, he has authority, direction, and control over the Department of Defense. The Pope, as you may know, is the head of the Catholic Church, which is a large bureaucracy. Next, the jobs come with specific responsibilities, and there are checks and balances, or at least some sort of reporting requirements for both. In the case of the Secretary of Defense, they serve not merely at the pleasure of the President, but must also report to Congress at least once a year, and often more frequently, on the expenditures, work, and accomplishments of the Department of Defense. The code states a report from each military department on the expenditures, work, and accomplishments of that department is also required. It then goes on to say that, quote, "itemized statements showing the savings of public funds and the eliminations of unnecessary duplications made under sections 125 and 191 of this code, and such recommendations as he considers appropriate." There are objectively fewer checks and balances on the Pope, but there is a reporting expectation and a really cute balcony to do it from. Similarly, not just anyone can be the Secretary of Defense or a Pope. Both roles can only be filled by certain people as defined by certain documents, and a council of specifically designated individuals has to vote in favor of the candidate. For the Secretary of Defense, we're talking about the Senate. For the Pope, it's the College of Cardinals, which are very fancy priests, not birds, even though they kind of sort of look like the bird. The U.S. Code goes on to detail all of the required attributes of the Secretary of Defense. Can't be someone who retired from the military within a specific number of years, depending on their military rank, for example. Do presidents nominate people who break this rule? Lately, unfortunately, yes. Those nominees, though, just need a waiver before they can be officially considered. I don't know the whole process for becoming Pope, and that is not what this channel is about, so I'm not going to do that, but I think we all know that not just anyone can be Pope. And just like between the Pope and the Secretary of Defense, since all these people have to vote for you, you have to get them to like you. But that's a story for another day. On to other similarities. I think it's also worth noting that only men have ever either been Pope. Finally, there's a similar vibe, kind of. At least there's like a very serious level of formality and structure to the job that results in an officialness that people understand, even if they're not part of that culture. Right? You don't have to be a Catholic to recognize priests have certain authority, and you don't have to be a Marine to recognize the Secretary of Defense is kind of a big deal. If you confess to a priest or an equivalent religious leader, it's protected in a court of law under confidentiality. So now imagine that we're talking about the Pope and not simply like the priest off Dairy Girls, right? And if you don't believe me how cross-cultural this formality really is, just go check out the readout from the recent meeting between the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, and the Pope. And if that's not your flavor of ice cream, how about the social media from the Pope meeting Kim Kardashian? And that brings us to, what is the job of the National Security Advisor? Or at least, what's the vibe? Officially, it's the assistant to the president for national security affairs. And honestly, it really is kind of Rasputin-y in that there is not a permanent legal definition of what this person does, their authorities, the office's structure, anything like that. The role is defined by the president each and every time and usually laid out in an official presidential memorandum shortly after the president takes office. While the Secretary of Defense is a Senate confirmable position and the Senate regularly requires the Secretary to answer publicly and privately to members, as the Constitution also requires, the National Security Advisor is just appointed by POTUS, and the hiring doesn't require any outside input. Similarly, the National Security Advisor's job is way more amorphous by design, and the authority and sphere of influence is really about the individual situation. No agency or department truly answers to the National Security Advisor, and while they are often incredibly influential, it is not an official decision maker, according to the U.S. Code. This person is a confidant and a sounding board to the president. Interestingly, you could summarize Rasputin's role exactly the same way. You would also not expect either to be called before Congress, and not just because Rasputin is dead. National security advisors don't testify before Congress usually. Why? Because most of their knowledge is covered by executive privilege, so it would be a pretty one-sided conversation. Look, truthfully, the Rasputin comparison feels a little unfair. Once elected, the president is entitled to select their advisors, and that includes a national security advisor. Rasputin, on the other hand, was just kind of like this Looney Tune, and Tsar Nicholas II was definitely not elected, so But the national security apparatus includes the Department of Defense, which is an enormous organization, but it is still only part of the ecosystem. There are 18 intelligence entities. Every department, especially the departments of State, Energy, Treasury, Homeland Security, have national security missions and offices. And we haven't even talked about the National Security Council or the National Intelligence Council or the National Homeland Defense and Security Council. Someone needs to serve as the primary point of contact because the president does actually have more to do than just national security, apparently. So the jellyfish level of structure here is not inherently sinister in the way that Rasputin was, and I don't want to insinuate that this is the case. I'm honestly just trying to explain the difference between these two super important jobs and why the jobs are different, and not be a Rasputin apologist.